I want to talk to you about a woman. Her name is Esther Morales. She was born in a place called San Jerónimo, Tlacochahuaya. It's a small Zapotec Indian community in the southern state of Oaxaca. It's a place that is rich in culture and tradition and community ties, but economically poor, and that has forced generations of its residents to migrate to other places. At age 14, she went to work in Mexico City. She first worked as a housemaid. She later opened her own food stand. But this was the late 1980s, and she could see how well her siblings and uncles and aunts were doing in the Los Angeles area. So she thought she might try to join them. She made her way to the border. She paid a smuggler $300 to get her across. And before she knew it, she was in Huntington Park, a suburb of Los Angeles. She found jobs easily in garment factories, in restaurant kitchens, and she had a daughter named Elisa. All the while, she kept going back to Oaxaca, as many Oaxacans do, to see family and to keep in touch with her roots. But she always then went back to California, paying a smuggler to get her across. It ended on one rainy winter day in Huntington Park at a retén, at a traffic stop. Police found that not only did she not have her driver's license, she was undocumented. That meant that she was eventually deported back to Mexico. She ended up in Tijuana at age 50, a woman with really little education and nobody to support her. Flash forward 8 years, though. Today, you will find her in downtown Tijuana at her little shop called La Antiguita. It's a tiny little restaurant with colorful murals, and she makes tamales, corn and meat, and they are the most delicious tamales that you could possibly find, she said. It's still hard. She still gets down. But, you know, with faith and hard work, dreams are possible, even in Mexico. I've been reporting about the US-Mexico border for 25 years now. I've covered everything: clandestine drug tunnels, I've covered grisly homicide scenes, I've covered the endangered vaquita, I've covered coastal contamination, political change, and I've covered trends in migration. And through it all, I have to say that it's meeting people like Esther Morales that make all the effort worthwhile. Because for all the politics and posturing that surrounds border issues, I really think it's, to me, the lives of individuals that are my door to understanding the complex human issues that play out here at the convergence of the United States and Mexico. For many of us, the border is just a minor inconvenience, a matter of waiting long enough in line, and there we are across. Many of us have lives that straddle both sides. As you all know, tens of thousands of Tijuanenses cross daily for their jobs in San Diego, and then they come back at night. And conversely, I think a growing young generation of San Diegans has discovered Tijuana, not just for lower rents, but for this kind of hip urban lifestyle that is not really accessible in San Diego. I cross all the time. I cross for work, I cross to see friends, I cross to take a dance class, danzón, and I cross to eat in all the wonderful restaurants and taco shops that the city offers. But for many, the border is really just a hard and harsh barrier, and we forget that sometimes in our daily lives. There was a time when Mexicans could cross the border without documents, get caught, come back, take voluntary departure, and cross right back again. And with enough times, you'd finally get across. But the game has changed. Not only are the physical barriers much harder, also the penalties for those who get caught are harsher, and the cost of smuggling has skyrocketed. So as a result, people who are deported now are less likely to go back to the United States, and they end up remaining in Mexico. You know, there is no formal tally. Nobody's done a formal tally. How many deportees are now living in Tijuana? They also come and go, so it's a very mobile population. But as I've been driving around the city in recent years, I'm surprised to see them. I've seen them, you know, they're my taxi drivers. Suddenly they're next to me on the bus. They're waiting to vote on election day, sometimes for the first time in their lives. Some are just quietly rebuilding their lives, not making waves. They're in a country that feels foreign to them, but they're doing their best. Others are really working the U.S. Legal and political systems, determined to go back to the only home they know, which is the United States. They've left behind spouses and children who are U.S. citizens and residents, and they hope with enough effort they will get back. And some are just not willing to wait, and they are going to go back across no matter what the cost. I've actually learned of some people who make it, but too many times we read tragic stories of people who die in the attempt. Going home. It's a topic that has going home. It's a theme, a universal theme that cuts across cultures and eras. In the ancient Greek poem, The Odyssey, the hero Odysseus spends 10 years to get back to his kingdom of Ithaca, and to his faithful wife Penelope. He has to confront a one-eyed monster, stormy seas, dangerous sirens, but he finally makes it. But for many deportees, going home is no allegorical poem. Deportees have told me that it is a devastating and dehumanizing experience. Back in their own country, they feel like exiles. Some people say deportees broke the law by entering the United States in the first place without documents, and they had it coming. But others say the process too often sends back people with deep community ties and family members in the U.S. who are U.S. citizens, spouses, and children. I, as a reporter who covers Tijuana, have not been covering this issue as much as the reality that awaits people when they are back in Mexico. If you just look at the numbers, they are staggering. Between 2009 and the end of 2017, Mexico's National Migration Institute calculated 2.6 million deportations from Mexico, 2.6 million deportations from the United States to Mexico. That is pretty much the population as large as the city of Chicago. If you'll notice, the numbers have gone down pretty drastically in recent years, but that's also in part because illegal immigration from Mexico to the United States is now at a 30-year low. So there are few people caught at the border that are getting deported. However, for the first few months of this year, the numbers of deportations have started to go back up again. They're about 30% higher than last year. Tijuana is a very important city in all of this. In the first through the end of July, from January through the end of July, there were 20,000 deportations, more than any other city on the US border. And that, when you really break it down, makes it 100 people a day. That's 100 people a day who show up here, often with barely any possessions, nowhere to go except maybe the shelters. US government figures are showing that more deportees who don't have criminal records are being deported. And a growing number are detained in the interior of the country, which implies that they've been in the United States for a longer period and have established lives. There's one trend that is, however, very clear. Fewer deportees are attempting to return to the United States after being deported, according to a study by the UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. For most people caught driving without a license in California, that means 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine at most. But for Esther Morales, on that rainy winter afternoon in Huntington Park on Pacific Boulevard, the price was far steeper. Not only was she driving without a license and had no immigration documents, when they checked the record, they found she had been deported already, not deported, sent back voluntarily is the term, 8 times. So rather than send her back to Mexico this time, they sent her to a federal prison where she did 6 months, and then they sent her back to Mexico. So she ended up in Tijuana. She was frightened and she was lonely, she told me, and she turned to alcohol sometimes. But she also persisted, and partly because she had no choice. And she still has no choice, she says. I am here, and I have to move forward. Work is her best therapy, she says, and also frequent visits from her daughter, Elisa, who lives in the Los Angeles area, is 23 years old, and is studying in Pasadena. She's studying psychology at college there. Esther Morales is a frequent and enthusiastic participant in a project at the University of California, Davis, called Humanizando la Deportación, humanizing deportation. In that, deportees like Esther Morales give testimony about their lives back in Mexico, and sometimes they are tragic. They talk about shakedowns by police and coming back to Mexico and having their family members not wanting anything to do with them. But some, like Esther, tell of opportunities and new beginnings. In Tijuana, a lot of the focus has been on those deportees who are addicted to drugs or who are homeless or who have joined the ranks of organized crime. That's what a lot of the news stories have been about because they make news. But in fact, most deportees are not homeless, they are not turning to crime, and they are not addicted to drugs. Most, I would say, are just undergoing a very difficult transition. Take the case of Fernando Santa Maria Ortega. When he first arrived in the city in 2014, he ended up, like many, at the Casa del Migrante. That is the city's oldest and largest migrant shelter. It's run by the Catholic missionaries, the Scalabrini brothers. He was born in Reynosa, in Tamaulipas, across the Texas border, but he remembers nothing about it at all. That's because at age 4, an uncle brought him across the border with somebody else's birth certificate, and he ended up in Visalia in the San Joaquin Valley. He went to public school, he played Little League Baseball, he pledged allegiance to the flag. Sounds like a pretty all-American boyhood, but it really wasn't in the end. He ran with a tough crowd, he ended up in jail on weapons and drug charges, and when his time was up, rather than release him back into the community, he was sent straight to Mexico. He stayed in Mexico for a few months and decided this was not for him. He made his way back to Visalia. He turned his life around this time. He ended up as a handyman. He worked with his uncles, and all was well for 10 years. But then, one day in 2012, he was caught on a DUI. And after being sent to a federal prison for 24 months, he was sent back to Mexico. In a little black bag that he purchased at the prison commissary, he told me he was carrying all his goods, all his worldly goods. And that included a Bible, a toothbrush, toothpaste, photographs, some letters, and just about $100 in cash. That's all he had to start his new life in Mexico. But wait, 4 years later, he's here in Tijuana. He is working at a call center where he is using his excellent English skills, and he's one of the top salesmen, has won several awards from the company. He's also developed this sort of entrepreneurial streak. He owns 3 Ubers and is starting his own loan business. He's close still to his family in Visalia, both parents, 6 siblings, and 2 US-born sons. But he knows that life is over. Visalia might be his hometown, he said, but Tijuana is now his home. He told me, one thing he told me that I always remember is starting over is possible, even in Mexico, and even for someone with a troubled past. And he has advice to fellow deportees: don't give up. By working and staying away from bad things, it'll be okay. I am grateful to Fernando and Esther and their willingness to share their stories. For all the hurdles placed in their way, they have moved forward, lives of promise and potential and hope. Deportees are on a most difficult journey, a journey to regain their place in the world. They're going to need all that grit that has pushed so many Mexicans forward and north for opportunity back here in Mexico as they remake their place in the world. You know, their journey to me is no less epic than that of the ancient and mythical Greek king Odysseus, as they face down monsters, resist false and seductive solutions, and traverse stormy waters. Meanwhile, we know that the news stories will continue, and they will shout. They will shout about new policy initiatives and executive orders and political proclamations and crises at the border. I only hope that when you follow the news accounts and learn of decisions made far from the border in the centers of power, that you will remember these lives that don't make headlines, that whisper about tenacity and courage and the reach of the human spirit. And think of the following, as I often do. If you were sent to live in a strange city and had no means of support and knew no one, if you were in the shoes of Fernando and Esther, how would you respond?